Hello and welcome to another episode of the DigiTeacher Digest. This week I'd like to continue with my look at Karl Maton's book Knowledge and Knowers and how he breaks down the different dimensions of legitimation code theory. So last week we broke down the dimension of specialization. There's always knowledge, what is known, and there's always knowers, who is doing the knowing. But this week I'd like to move on to look at the dimension of semantics. And semantics is broken down into gravity and density. Gravity is how context-dependent a knowledge claim is. Is it concrete, contextualized, or is it abstract and more generalized? And we'll go on to look at density, or how simple or complex something is. Semantic gravity can be read on a spectrum between highly concrete and contextualized, and more abstract, generalized, moving across different contexts. So let's take an example. In the field of history, let's take a highly concrete, very contextualized moment. During the Russian Revolution, in I think August of 1917, the 1st Machine Gun Regiment went to the Smolny Institute where the Bolsheviks had their headquarters and demanded that the Bolsheviks lead the revolution then. The Bolsheviks apparently cowered for a few hours inside, not sure what to do, and eventually it was Trotsky who went out and explained to them that he didn't think that the conditions were yet ripe for revolution in Russia. And if we abstract that idea out, what are the conditions needed for a revolution, for this revolution, for any revolution? What conditions are needed? That's an abstract and generalizable idea. So we can talk about a spectrum from stronger semantic gravity, more heavily contextualized, to weaker semantic gravity, more free of context, more abstract. And thinking about semantic gravity and semantics in this way, I think it gives us a language, and it allows us to see similar forces at work across multiple disciplines and across multiple practices. So what's true in history is also true in physical science, it's true in computing education, it's true in English literature, it's true in art, and it gives a common way of looking at all disciplines within a school in a very similar way. And a very powerful tool to ICT champions, those teachers in the school who are responsible for helping teachers integrate ICTs into their teaching. It provides a common language and way of looking at it, which I want to pick up a little bit later. Thinking about how this works across time allows us also to analyze classroom practice. It allows us to see what's going on in a classroom as a teacher is teaching and as students are learning. So if we plot the strengthening or weakening of semantic gravity on a graph across time, you can see different semantic profiles. One of these profiles is called the high semantic flat line, and you can see that what's happening in the classroom kind of remains at this very abstract and decontextualized level. This is kind of the level of theory. It's never being contextualized for students. It remains at a very highly abstract level, and this is fine if you have experts talking amongst each other, because experts will understand what those abstractions mean. But for most classroom practices, this would be a very unuseful profile. On the other hand, we sometimes see in classrooms a low semantic flatline. Meaning always remains at a highly contextualized level. So students are never being challenged to extract any ideas or anything which can be used, transferred across different contexts. It's very kind of maybe experientially based. Students are doing something. This is the realm of practice, without any theory intervening. So a lot of discovery learning, for example, remains at this level unless the teacher is helping scaffold students to extract ideas or anything useful out of their discovery. Low semantic flatline is as unhelpful as a high semantic flatline. Another very common profile in the classroom is that of the down escalator. So a teacher might take an idea and unpack that idea and explain it, use metaphors, use examples, use everyday language and students' own experience to help unpack that idea, to help explain that idea, to bring it home to students so that students are able to understand it. This is not a mistake. It's a very powerful profile in the classroom. It's a very common profile in the classroom. Teachers explaining ideas is absolutely vital, and I think is the bedrock of educational practice. If teachers weren't doing this, I think it would be a huge dereliction of duty. But what often happens is that you get a series of down escalators. So a teacher will explain one concept or idea, make it accessible to students, mediate it for students, and then go on to explain another idea, and you get a series of down escalators. And the problem with this is that those ideas, those separate ideas, are not being linked together. And that becomes the problem. Nothing wrong with the down escalator, but you need some up escalators as well. You need to take students' own experience, what students know, their past knowledge and so on, and help students build and extract ideas out of that. You need to be able to link student understanding to the kinds of ideas, the abstractions, more highly contextualized knowledge that you want them to build. So cumulative knowledge building, it's absolutely crucial that you don't just have a series of down escalators, a high semantic flat line, a low semantic flat line, or even just a series of up escalators. What you need is for all of this to be linked. And this linking together of the strengthening and weakening of semantic gravity is called a semantic wave. And although LCT generally is not prescriptive, it's not describing what should be happening, it's describing what is happening in a classroom. Semantic waves have been shown to be highly associated with effective lessons. You need an unpacking of ideas, and you need students to be able to repack those ideas. So is this waving, this ability to move between abstract and concrete and abstract repeatedly, does this correlate highly with successful lessons? Yes. Is there a particular wave profile that's associated with successful lessons? No, it depends on each context. So you might start a lesson very much with students' own past knowledge, their own experience, and build up to a concept or idea that you want students to acquire, or you can do it the other way. Not every movement of the wave has the full amplitude from the strongest semantic gravity to the weakest semantic gravity. Very often there are gradations, and you're moving students through this process. The wave form itself doesn't really matter. That was highly dependent on a teacher's lesson plan and how they've structured their lesson. But the weakening and strengthening of semantic gravity seems crucial in any educational practice. Paul Curzon and Jane Waite have done a lot of work in the UK popularising the use of semantic waves in computer science education, culminating in the recent government report on the state of computer science education. Waving in computing education, I think, is particularly important because computer science is often viewed as such a difficult and abstract subject. So this diagram shows Paul Curzon's famous magic trick, which is used to explain how an algorithm works. And you can see the gradual weakening of semantic gravity from doing the trick, actually doing the trick. The student does the trick, and then that's linked to how does the trick work. And that describes obviously an algorithm, and then from that the learner and the teacher can explain what an algorithm is. What's great here, I think, is understanding that both the learner and the teacher working with the learner together in packing this idea, so that a student goes away being able to understand what an algorithm means. So this just shows the weakening of semantic gravity. And obviously this just describes one lesson and one particular wave profile, semantic wave profile. There are many, many different profiles which are possible and useful for different purposes. what I think is helpful in the way that Curzon and Waite are putting this together is showing how the waving has to be done, A, by the teacher, modeling activities, modeling understanding and scaffolding it, but B, in the learning of the student. The learner has to follow the same processes, has to follow the wave as well. And you know, you can imagine a lesson in which the teacher is walking a class through a perfect semantic wave, but a particular student in the class is just flatlining. They're just not understanding, or they're not engaging, and are not moving through the wave. So using waves is a very useful way of thinking about what's going on in the classroom, but of course it merely describes what's happening. Should teachers be using it pedagogically? And this is the way that Curzon and Waite have been arguing, that it forms a distinct pedagogical approach, that as a teacher what you're trying to do is trying to get those movements between abstract and concrete and abstract. And in next week's video I want to look at semantic density, the movement between the simple and the complex as well. You want to get those waves going, and therefore it does form a pedagogical approach. From my own practice, I find it very useful if I'm standing in a classroom and to sort of analyze what's going on, to get kind of basic feedback on how the lesson is going. I tend to think in terms of, I think I'm flatlining at this point. I can see from the eyes of students that it's kind of up here, and I want them to understand a bit more. So I have to then kind of inject a strengthening of semantic gravity. Or if I see that they're perfectly well engaging with their own experience, their own understanding of something, but they're not getting to where I want them to get, I need to weaken the semantic gravity. I need to find some way of getting them to understand the concepts that I want them to grasp. So it's a very useful kind of shorthand for me in the classroom to think about. And when I'm looking at student writing, for example, as an English teacher, if you think about the perfect paragraph, it introduces an idea and unpacks it with examples, with anecdote, with detail. It moves from the level of an abstract idea to the level of the concrete, and you get this constant moving between paragraphs, between the sort of grainy detail that a writer is bringing in and the ideas, the themes that are emerging from the piece of writing. And you want students to be able to grasp that, and you want students to be able to reproduce that in their own writing. And you can do that quite consciously. So I have taught semantic waving as a writing technique, very much so. You know, when English teachers say, for example, new idea, new paragraph, you know, if you've got a new idea, it needs to be in a new paragraph. Well, very much that's describing there's the level of decontextualization, which works across the pieces of writing as a whole, and each paragraph needs to flesh that out, add detail, add anecdote, or facts and quotations, or whatever it is. So very much semantic waving can be used as a pedagogy. But what I want to look at is the usefulness of semantic waving in terms of the person responsible for ICT integration in a school. In other words, can this be used to help the ICT integrator, the ICT champion, to help students, to help teachers bring in the right digital tools for their teaching practice? The way I like to think of it is that at any particular time, I'm either trying to strengthen or weaken semantic gravity in the classroom. And in order to do that, I'm either using a particular pedagogy, I'm using some kind of educational technology, either pedagogy, thinking skill, or digital tools to do that. And I'd like to unpack a few examples of how you can use different tools. When you're teaching poetry, poetry is largely constructed of images, and you need to be able to have students unpack these images to understand what it is that the poet is saying. So let's say I'm teaching Emily Dickinson's I Dwell in Possibility, and at a certain point she talks about the gambrels of the sky. Well, what on earth is a gambrel? So one way of strengthening the semantic gravity to help students understand what a gambrel is to use Google Images. So on my interactive whiteboard, I simply go into Google Images and type in gambrel, and you get loads of images of different types of gambrels. So a gambrel is a meat hook of a particular shape, and it also describes the shape of the eaves, the roof of a typical New England home, the sort of that type of shape. And it's very difficult to describe what a gambrel is without showing it as an image. In the old days, before interactive whiteboards and indeed before the internet, I used to draw on a board. So I would just draw a gambrel on the whiteboard. Well, it was a blackboard back then even, and to help the students understand it. But one of the chief affordances of something like Google Images is that you don't just see one image. You see images in different contexts, gambrels as meat hooks and gambrels as the shape of the roof of a New England house. And so you're able to abstract the idea of a gambrel from that much more easily. So Google Images, for example, is a perfect tool for strengthening semantic gravity to help students to visualize what's being talked about. And I've seen the same in maths classes. So when you're talking about a function in maths, that's highly abstract. But if you use graphing software like GeoGebra and things like that, then you can make a change in the function and you can immediately see what it does to the graph. And it helps students to visualize what those abstractions, highly abstract functions actually mean and how they can be altered. So visualization tools in particular help to strengthen semantic gravity. If you think about simulation software in physics, if you're simulating an electric circuit, for example, and by changing series and parallel, etc., students can visualize and can see what will happen when they make that change, and that helps them to abstract the ideas out of that. But there are other tools which are highly useful in the weakening of semantic gravity or to help in that repacking process. So let's say we want students to evaluate different approaches to a problem, which is essentially taking out specific contextualized knowledge and then able to assess it and evaluate it, which is more decontextualized knowledge. So we're weakening the semantic gravity. One way of doing this is to use a jigsaw technique. So this is a cognitive tool, it's a pedagogy, and you can link it to digital technologies such as Google Docs, for example. So you can get students to form a home group, and then one member of each home group goes into another group, which then researches a particular aspect of the topic. And then when they come back into the home group, they are experts in that field. And then the group as a whole has to make an evaluation and a recommendation on whatever it is. And what this kind of structure, and they can do that using a Google Doc, which allows them to author collaboratively. So what they are doing is they are taking highly contextualized information, knowledge in different aspects of a field, and then evaluating it and putting together that evaluation. But a really core insight at the heart of it all is that different tools and different pedagogies can be used both to strengthen and to weaken semantic gravity. It really is how the tool is used rather than the tool itself. All of this comes with experience. So someone who's an ICT integrator probably has a fair amount of experience using different tools. But what the idea of the semantic wave, I think, allows that integrator to do is to ask the crucial question, well, what is it, the teacher that I'm advising, what is it that they are trying to do in their classroom? And whether it's in a maths classroom or a physics classroom, it essentially comes down to, are they trying to weaken or strengthen semantic gravity? And then you can advise both what tools are useful for that and also how the tool is used. So I think it gives crucial insights to ICT integrators and all teachers generally, in their own teaching, that you can then play with, and you can go away and experiment with, find out how the tools are useful to you, because it's highly individualized and it's highly contextualized. So in the example of using Google Images to unpack what it is that a gambrel is, you have a strengthening of semantic gravity, but in looking at different images of gambrels, you have a weakening of semantic gravity. And so the same tool can be used in both directions. It depends on how it's used. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the DigiTeacher Digest. If you have, please subscribe to the channel, click on like, please share it as widely as you can, and hit the notification bell to make sure that you never miss another episode again.